The 2023 spring game is in the books for Tennessee football, wrapping up Josh Heupel's third spring camp with the Vols since he's taken over as head coach. The White beat the Orange 17-14 in the Orange and White game Saturday. Last little bit of football we're going to see until fall camp, and at that point, preseason will be well underway. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Caleb Calhoun with Off the Hook Sports with Dave Hooker. Again, last couple of days we've been doing the show, so I've been doing it solo. Dave Hooker is back on Monday, but this is a special recap, special instant reactions from the Orange and White game, which came to an end just a few moments ago. As we all know, it's hard to fully read into the Orange and White game and exactly what is relevant, what we're going to see. I mean, these things are giant teases, and Josh Heupel is probably the cagiest of cagey when it comes to showing things. He doesn't want to reveal a lot of things. And that's probably the biggest takeaway from this game, is that you didn't see 5% of what you're really going to see when fall camp starts and when the games start. But just to break down a few things, let's talk about the weapons that did stand out. The obvious point is the tight ends and the running backs, but not the running backs that we all thought. We didn't see anything from Dylan Sampson, Jabari Small, or Jalen Wright. Cam Seldon and Deshaun Bishop both were the stars. Remember, it was kind of intriguing and interesting that Heupel moved Cam Seldon to running back at the start of the year, at the start of spring camp. He was an athlete. And Seldon did have 10 carries for 44 yards, and he also caught 3 passes for 43 yards, and he ran for 1 touchdown. Deshaun Bishop added 24 carries for 88 yards. I got to be honest, from the running back's perspective, if they were looking for a new weapon, I don't think they found one. I think, and if anything, it's what they didn't show. Neither side averaged more than could get to the 5 yards per carry mark. Cam Seldon did have a fumble, so they were the most productive technically offensively in this game, but there just wasn't a lot to see from them. I think it's pretty clear that Sampson, Small, and Wright are going to be the star running backs when the fall arrives. Now, as far as the other weapons, where you did see something from was actually the tight ends. That's one of the intriguing ones. Tennessee's tight ends, by committee, collectively as a unit, actually did fairly well. Ethan Davis, we heard a lot about Ethan Davis at the start of spring practice, and he did have 3 catches for 53 yards and a score. McCall Castles, the notable transfer from California, not the University of California, I think it was UC Irvine, but UC Davis, excuse me. He had 2 catches for 9 yards, and he had been and so between Davis and Castles, you saw some potential. Now, the first 2 scores were to Dayton Sneed and Hunter Salmon, both tight ends. You're not going to see much from either this year. You might see some from Hunter Salmon if they're really looking for depth. You're not going to see anything from Dayton Sneed. We just have to be honest with that. But still, the tight ends and the running backs were the most productive weapons. I think of any of those, the only ones you saw that you might see a lot from in the fall will be the 2 tight ends, Dylan Sampson, Ethan Davis, and McCall Castles. Moving on, quarterbacks. They showed very little. Gaston Moore was the best quarterback on the field in this game. Does anybody think he's going to be a starter this year for Tennessee football? Obviously not. That is the ultimate proof you need that you should take very little from this game. Moore's first touchdown, to his credit, was to Dayton Sneed. He had the first 2 touchdowns of the game, and that touchdown to Dayton Sneed was a beautiful pass. It was a 4-yard fade in the red zone, and he and Sneed both made a great play. He made a great throw. Dayton Sneed made a great play on the ball. Got to give him credit where credit is due. He finished the game 8 of 12 for 94 yards and 2 touchdown passes. Did have an interception, but we're going to get to that. That interception wasn't really his fault. Now, as far as the 2 quarterbacks everybody cares about, Joe Milton III was his usual self in the intermediate passing game. He did have a beautiful 39-yard pass to Caleb Webb, and he had a touchdown pass to Caleb Webb on that same drive. The touch on the deep ball still doesn't seem to be there. The intermediate passing game we knew that he was good in that, and actually he was probably better than Hendon Hooker in that, and he again showed that in this game, but he still hasn't shown that he's better at all on the deep ball. He finished 9 of 13 for 79 yards and a score. Nigo Iamaleava, if we're going to be honest, was probably the worst throwing the ball but that had more to do with decision making and him being raw. He was 8 of 16 for 112 yards, but Iamaleava he had great pocket awareness. That was what I think stood out with Iamaleava. He knew where to step in the pocket. He knew when to scramble. He knew when to roll out. You have to give him a lot of credit for that as a true freshman. And look, we're forgetting Iam Aliava was reworking his footwork and his fundamentals and his mechanics from the minute he came in spring ball. As great of a thrower as I think he is, you couldn't expect too much from him in just 3 weeks of practice, 4 weeks of practice, whatever it is. The mobility factor with quarterbacks, there were some runs. I didn't read too much into it because they couldn't be tackled, obviously. They were called down the minute they were touched, or even if they were even if they were close to being touched. Before I move on, I want to go to the board a little bit, to the chat board. John Hill says Moore looked pretty good. You're right, John, he did. That first touchdown pass wasn't just a schemed play. That was a great throw by Gaston Moore. Thomas Doe says, is the defense going to get any better this season? I don't know. That was hard to glean from the spring game. I think the defense may have been somewhat ahead of the offense in the early part of spring practice. And in this game, you did see, quite honestly, you saw the pass defense. It seemed like the defensive backs maybe had the advantage in this game to a certain degree. So that could be a good sign that the secondary is improving. But I think it's more reflective of my next takeaway, which is Tennessee didn't play any of their main receivers. Okay, Brew McCoy, Ramel Keaton, Squirrel White, Dante Thornton. Those are the 4 guys. Those are the guys that are going to be in the rotation. If Josh Heupel may shorten it to 3, maybe 2, but if he does, it's among those 4 guys. The leading receivers in this game were Caleb Webb and Chaz Nimrod. I mean, wide receivers, not receivers. Nimrod had 3 catches for 15 yards. Webb had 3 catches for 50 yards, and he had that touchdown pass from Joe Milton in that 39-yard grab. Both of them have potential going forward, but they're not going to be in the rotation this year. Don't read anything into what you saw from the receivers in this game. You saw Chaz Nimrod have a pretty bad drop, honestly, on a 4th down, and you also saw an interception. I think it was a backup walk-on receiver that was thrown to Cameron Miller, and it was because the receiver didn't fight for the ball. So it was just, if anybody played poorly at all in this game, it was the receiver unit. And you can see how Josh Heupel ran in the backups with the running backs and the receivers. None of them are going to be anything when fall camp arrives. I think you might see something from Cam Seldon or Deshaun Bishop. I will say that. They didn't show enough in this one, though. So at this point, it's Samson Small and Wright at the running back spots. And it's Ramel Keaton, Brew McCoy, Squirrel White, and Dante Thornton maybe at the receiver spots. So none of the weapons at either of those really showed anything today. On the other side, because of this, by default, pass coverage didn't look too bad. Cameron Miller, who was a former receiver himself, did have that interception, although that was more about the receiver not fighting for the ball. Gabe Judulale had a pass breakup, and Danico Slaughter, Kamal Haddon, Christian Charles all had one as well. Those are all familiar faces from last year. Jordan Matthews and Ricky Gibson are still going to be the main guys, along with Judy Leali, though, that we're looking forward to see who stands out at cornerback. Tennessee needs to find more talent at cornerback. Warren Burrell is getting healthy again. He missed all of last year after the Pittsburgh game. And they're also looking for a safety because they have a void to fill there. So we'll have to see what goes on with that. John Hill says they were missing some players, too, on both sides. You're right, John. They were missing some players, and a lot of players were just held out. And it made it really hard to really gain anything from this game. One drive I thought where we gained something, though, was the first drive of the second half. And that was enough for me to say Omar Norman-Lott, the guy who transferred from Arizona State, might be the guy to start next to Amari Thomas at defensive tackle. He might be the guy to replace Latrell Bumpus. He blew up multiple plays on that drive and assisted on a sack. They obviously need another defensive lineman alongside Amari Thomas, and Norman-Lott looks like he's going to be the guy. For what it's worth, at the edge rusher positions, because they're looking for somebody to replace Byron Young and start alongside Tyler Barron, Joshua Josephs and James Pierce both had a lot of hype. Mike Eckler said Roman Harrison was the best of them in camp. Josephs did have a tackle for a loss in this game. So we might have seen the guys who replaced Bumpus and Byron Young this year. We don't know. Again, very, very, very minimal, should we say, playbook, minimal, very, very, very minimal use of what we're going to see in the season this year. I can't stress that enough. There's not much to read in from this. It was a fun spring game. Here's the biggest takeaway. I'm going to actually give you guys the biggest takeaway. 60,000. There were about 60,000 people at this game, and that's not – you've seen spring games have more than that. Not when they charged, though. Tennessee charged for this spring game, and 60,000 came out. The interest – this comes on the heels of the news of the $70,000 season ticket sales earlier in the week. Guys, the interest in Tennessee football is through the roof, It's rivaling Tennessee football interest in the late 90s, early 2000s. Josh Heupel's really got something going here. Did anybody notice the cheers when Nico Iamaleava first came out and took his first snap? It felt like an actual game. It felt like someone actually had scored a touchdown in a real game, not a night game. I'd say a Saturday afternoon game against a Group of 5 school. I mean, it gave off those vibes. You have to give Tennessee credit for that. That was probably the fan support was the biggest takeaway. That's not a fluke. And so I think long term, you're going to see more of that. Depending on what Tennessee does this year, the thing about Joe Milton is one of the things that made him limited. I want to get to the mobility factor again. Joe Milton's size which makes him so hard to tackle is a huge advantage of his. He couldn't really exploit that today because they were keeping him so protected. I will say that there's not going to be a quarterback controversy with Gaston Moore. I can tell you that, but it was pretty intriguing to see him make some nice throws. So if Nico's not ready for the fall, you can at least be happy that, okay, maybe Gaston could manage being a backup. He was the backup, by the way, at the end of last year after Hooker tore his ACL. He was Joe Milton's backup. So it was very intriguing how this all played out. Apparently, I'm following Twitter as I'm talking to you guys, and reportedly Josh Allen post-game said 3 of the top 4 receivers who didn't play would have played if it was a real game today. He's obviously talking about McCoy, Keaton, and Squirrel White because Dante Thornton was banged up. There was no reason to use him. He called Cameron Seldon electric. Okay, he was, but you honestly have to be disappointed that he didn't gain more yards on average. I will say a weak unit for Tennessee, and they're still working things around. This was the offensive line. They gave up a few tackles for a loss, sack or so, and Seldon nor Bishop could average over 5 yards a carry. There are obviously questions there with right tackle, and left guard. The reason there's questions at left tackle is because Jeremiah Crawford and Gerald Mincy have moved over to right tackle, and we don't know between them and then Andres Carrick and John Campbell at left tackle, and then who replaces Jerome Carvin at left guard. We don't know how that's going to shake out. There was nothing to learn from that in this game. I think overall, quite honestly, the biggest takeaway is Joe Milton still has a nice touch in the intermediate passing game. John Hill says, sure hope Ethan has a stinger and hasn't injured his non-repaired shoulder. Yeah, that's true. Ethan Davis did get hurt. He did get hurt in this game. That is a bit of a concern. He was the weapon of spring ball for Tennessee early on. I don't think it's going to be serious. I will say this, even though he was a weapon, Tennessee has Jacob Warren at tight end. I think they know they can be okay. John Hill, start more to motivate Joe. Kind of kidding. Very, very funny. Yeah, I think that's actually probably another big takeaway. Good catch on that, John. Ethan Davis's injury. That was a bit scary. That's why you don't play a lot of your players in a spring game. That's the biggest reason for stuff like that. But I will say, I wonder if you think, and comment on the message boards on this, guys. Give me your thoughts. Did Tennessee cheat their fans? Look, they charged for the spring game, which was crazy. You never charge for spring games. They charged, and then they held almost all of their elite players out, particularly in the skill positions. Is that cheating your fans? Or do the fans not care because they just want their players healthy for the fall? I think about it with the NBA. They talk about load management all the time. Are you cheating the fans when you said the stars, or do you want the stars healthy and fresh for the playoffs? It's a real debate. But in the end, spring practice has come to an end. The White beats the Orange 17-14. The next football-related news we'll be talking over the next month is obviously the NFL draft, which is not even over the next month, over the next couple of weeks, to be honest with you. And then once the draft ends, you're in full football offseason mode until SEC Media Days. At that point, it's recruiting and fun features. And we got a lot of stuff happening. Please hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks for tuning in to this little special spring practice recap. It was fun covering it while it lasted. Spring camp is in the books, and football season is less than 5 months away, guys. Who's ready? I know I am. You guys have a great day. Enjoy the NBA playoffs, which are underway now. Go enjoy the weather if it's as nice where you are as it is where I am. And we will be back with you Monday. Dave Hooker should be back on the show with us at that point, and we'll dive into more spring game coverage while also starting to talk about the NFL draft and other news going around the college football and college sports world. I am Caleb Calhoun with Off the Hook Sports. You guys have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks for tuning in.